Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Seeking Sustainability Live number 158. And we have Bobby Judo with us this morning. Thanks for joining, Bobby.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me on. 158.
And
Wow.
158, yeah. When I joined your Japan by River cruise, it was so fun.
Yeah.
That was October, was it?
Yeah.
I think.
I don't remember
Yeah.
the exact date, but you were on 100. We were congratulating you on your 100th episode when you joined
Oh
us.
yeah. So I'm hoping to keep going as long as I can. How about you guys?
No, we're done.
That's enough.
No.
You've done
Actually,
what you
we
wanted to
just
do.
we released our latest episode a minute ago. It's on JapanByRiverCruise.com. After you check this out, head over there. We're talking to Baye McNeil about that Nike commercial.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, well,
Yeah.
let's talk about Japan by River Cruise. There might
Mhm.
be some people who don't know what it is. Can you give us a little summary intro?
Yes, Japan by River Cruise is a weekly comedy podcast that focuses on my co-host Ollie Horn's love of the Japanese river cruise industry. We do in-depth talk and reviews of river cruises, and then we also have guests on, and we get a lot of journalists, political aides, former idols, Japanese cultural figures, influencers, and we talk about Japanese news, culture, language, politics, economics, all kinds of stuff, and we find a way to make it funny and about river cruises.
Yeah. Always about river cruises.
Yes.
One of Ollie Horn, your co-host, was in the
Hmm.
series previously, and we had a great discussion. He's based in Malaysia, and you're
Yeah.
in Fukuoka, but you guys were doing stand-up comedy together at one point in Fukuoka. Can you tell us about that?
Well, you say he's based in Malaysia. We should specify
Oh,
that
he's
that's
not?
not by choice. He's stuck
No.
there.
Yeah. Okay.
He didn't plan that. But no, he was in Fukuoka for 4 or 5 years, and he started a stand-up comedy community here. And there are a handful of communities around Japan. There's a really good one in Osaka. There's a huge scene in Tokyo. And so our scene was in Fukuoka, but we kind of work with other groups and travel around and do English stand-up comedy and Japanese language stand-up comedy, trying to kind of preserve the stand-up comedy sensibilities as distinct from Japanese comedy. Um, some would say the English shows went much better than the Japanese ones, but the Japanese ones were interesting and fun, and a lot to learn from them.
Wow, great. Your story, I was listening to Japan Station
Yeah,
and
yeah,
your interview with Tony
yeah.
and talking about how you got started working together. Ollie was looking for someone who could do Japanese comedy. Is that right?
Yeah, I had been doing YouTube in Japanese for a long time, and also Japanese TV and Japanese radio for I think 5 or 6 years by the time Ali came to Fukuoka. And so when he was researching people he could ask to come and do a stand-up comedy set in Japanese, he came across my YouTube and knew that I was somebody who had kind of who wanted to be funny, who was trying to be funny and express myself humorously in both languages. And he twisted my arm into doing it in Japanese. And then after my Japanese set, he said, "You've got to do it in English. You've got to do it in English," and really kind of got me into performing in English. And now I'd say, when I because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to for a long time, but performing stand-up comedy professionally is like the most fun that I have working.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
In the same Japan Station interview, you were talking about the gap between an audience who's there ready to listen to jokes from a foreigner and then the general Japanese audience. Could you talk
Right,
about
right.
that a little bit? That was really interesting.
Yeah, so when we first started doing these shows, we would advertise them as, foreigners performing in Japanese, performers performing Western comedy in Japanese. And when you advertise a show and sell tickets for it that way, you get a very specific audience. And that specific audience is bilingual Japanese people or Japanese people who are already interested in foreigners or Japanese people who have lived overseas or who want to enjoy foreign culture. So you're selecting out an audience that is already inclined to enjoy what you're doing. It doesn't necessarily, the quality doesn't matter that much. You've got an extremely friendly audience. And one of the things that's difficult about stand-up comedy as a medium in general is that there's all this pressure to perform to perform and to please the audience in real time. And if you don't, you hear back from them immediately. And that energy affects the rest of the show. And so that's why you have people who have nights where they bomb horribly or nights where they destroy. And with our Japanese shows, we were packing the crowd with such a friendly audience that you could have a mediocre set and still kill. And I kind of realized that halfway through, because my work on TV and in events and things like that, I was performing to very different types of crowds. It wasn't these crowds that were just there to see a foreigner and to feel good about enjoying foreign culture and being able to laugh at the foreigner's jokes. It was the average Japanese person who wasn't watching a TV show to see me, who wasn't coming to a concert to hear, the foreigner tell funny jokes. They were just an average person. And so when you try those same jokes out that you think are super strong because they've destroyed in this very friendly crowd, you get blank stares, or you get people who go, "What are you talking about?" Or "That's not funny, get off the stage." And it was a very different experience. And so I think real quick I got a handle on what kind of jokes worked better for a general audience and what kind of jokes would hit harder for the average Japanese person, and not just a Japanese person who wanted to enjoy stand-up comedy. And because of that, I started tailoring my set so that in the end I felt like what I was doing wasn't English stand-up anymore. It was more signposted Japanese comedy. So it kind of became like not self-defeating, but against the original purpose.
Yeah. You were talking about how with Japanese comedy, quite often you have to kind of tell the audience you're going to laugh at this. Like
Right.
tell the punchline in advance and
Right.
then lead them through a story or something. Is that right?
Yeah, I think with a Western English-speaking comedy audience, there's this mental work that the audience does to try to get to the joke, to try to figure out the punchline before the comedian tells it. And that's why when they get surprised, that's why when they go, "Oh, that's where that joke went," there's that reaction. And it's a borderline off-color joke, but it's one that Ollie and I have used before as kind of an explanation of a joke that would work for an English audience and not a Japanese audience. And it's a joke that's like, what do you call a black man with an Asian wife who works in an Indian restaurant? You call him by his name, of course. And it's a really dumb joke, but it's that idea that, the audience is listening and expecting something racist is going to come. Something where those three factors are going to factor into, and they're anticipating something racist, and then you say the obvious answer. And you tell that same joke to a Japanese person, and there's no anticipation. They just listen and they go, "Okay, it doesn't matter that he's black, that he has an Asian wife, that he works in an Indian restaurant." They're just listening. And then when you say his name, they go, "Yeah, that makes sense." And so there's no leap, there's no critical thinking. And when you watch the majority of mainstream Japanese comedy, because this doesn't apply to all Japanese comedy, but the majority of mainstream Japanese comedy, it's designed to appeal to as many people as possible. And so it's very much like a Laurel and Hardy, a straight man and a guy who says weird stuff.
Or physical comedy, like slapstick.
Or physical comedy. Lowest common denominator, really easy to understand. So making jokes about people's appearances, slapstick, pratfalls, or somebody says something dumb and the other person goes, "You just said something dumb." And the audience goes, "Oh, that's right, he did. And now we understand that this was intentional. And now we understand that this is the marker that means it's okay to laugh, and we'll laugh at that." And there's a lot of repetition and a lot of signposting, as we call it.
Right. And you were talking about that a little bit in Japan by River Cruise, how sometimes the guests, well, including myself, won't get the joke until later. And you guys are often saying stuff which is a joke, but maybe the guest might take it seriously, or, but that's part of the podcast comedy, right?
Well, we tread very carefully because we do handle a lot of serious issues in our podcast. Like, we like to talk about, social issues and politics and gender issues and diversity issues. And so we're talking about very serious things. and there's always kind of a worry that how much is it okay to make a joke out of this? And we have to be very careful with the targets of the joke so that we're not punching down, we're not being offensive. And if it's a guest who is not familiar with the show or who we don't have a personal relationship with ahead of time and is coming in cold, you kind of have to prep them and go, we're gonna be trying to make this light, while respecting it, while taking it seriously, but we're going to try to make it a fun listen. And some guests are very on board with that. And I mean, most guests, so far, all of the guests have been on board with that. And I cross my fingers and knock wood every time, because Ollie in particular tends to be very courageous in the kinds of jokes he attempts. And sometimes I go, oh my God, if they don't take that well, you've just ruined an episode. But so far, it hasn't happened.
Well, you seem to have a great guest list of people that hopefully have listened to your episode before going on your show, so they know the style that you guys are using.
Well,
yeah, but when my family was listening to our episode, and my husband and my son were like, you sound like you're crazy. Like, you guys tapped into something that just set me going on things that I normally would not say because it's not politically correct, or it's not something I would say in consulting, but it was so fun. So yeah, if you listen to my episode, guys, don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, I think we called it the worst ways to travel Japan.
Yeah.
You're talking about you were telling us about, sustainability ideas and these very kind of sweeping policy changes that you're right.
Yeah.
If you brought them up in a board meeting, people would go, we can't do any of this stuff. But it's all very, very, it comes from a place of an understanding of the kinds of major changes that need to happen for there to be any actual change. But what we like about our guests is
good comedy, right? There's always a grain of truth in there. So some of the crazy things I said, like get rid of the cruise ship industry, for example, there is a grain of truth.
That probably didn't make the final episode. I'm sure that was edited out.
And I'm in the tourist industry, so that's not great for my career, but there is a grain of truth in there. It has been a big problem, especially during coronavirus, right?
Yeah. You said no more buses, get rid of all the tour buses.
Yeah. I kind of stand behind that. Yeah. Or control them better. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we really enjoy about the guests that we get and the way we pick our guests is there's so much interesting Japan content online and so many interesting articles that are written about Japan. And so I think we realize that we tend to see so many headlines that we go, oh, that's interesting, or oh, I have an opinion about this headline on Twitter, but you don't get a chance to really get into it. So instead of reading the articles, we started just asking the people who wrote them to come on the show and explain them to us.
But you guys do your research too. I mean, you have some very interesting guests and very serious topics like you talk about. So do you have a formula? Like, how do you choose your guests? How do you choose your topics?
So we usually start with who we want to talk to, unless there's something big in the news like this Nike commercial or Black Lives Matter or the incoming Suga administration when Suga was selected as prime minister. Unless there's a big news topic that we know this is the topic that we need to talk about this week, we start with who we want to talk to, and we look into their work and what they're most knowledgeable about, and then we try to find a way to connect it to a current event. And it's been surprisingly easy. We wanted to talk to Oleg Benish, who's a scholar at York University, and he studies castle history and samurai history, and has written a book on how the concept of Bushido, the samurai way, was invented. It wasn't like a historically accurate depiction of the way the samurai lived and the code that they lived by. It was invented years and years later, 200 some years after there were no more samurai. That's not correct, but after the samurai weren't fighting anymore, by people who were like looking back wistfully, nostalgically on better days, kind of the way that Victorian chivalry developed out of like the code of honor of knights. And knights weren't really honorable people. They were murderers on horseback. They fought and killed, and it was this upper class that was looking back and saying, oh, there's this code of masculinity. There's something romantic about the way they lived. And it was exactly the same thing. It was a response to Victorian chivalry in Japan. They said, oh, they're doing that, we could do it too. And they invented this samurai code. And we looked at the ways that that had, changed throughout the years, through, Japan's different historical periods, when they were a successfully warring country, when they were an unsuccessful warring country, and then through peacetime. And we wanted to talk about that. And then in researching it, kind of look into how Bushido comes up in the news these days. And it just so happened that those couple of weeks there were discussions about how Bushido, the samurai code, and social compliance, and putting other people's well-being above your own, tied into Japan's reactions and handling of the coronavirus. And so there's always some kind of way to link the topic that we want to talk about into what's going on in Japan now.
That's cool. And one of the reasons I love talking to you and Ollie and talking about comedy and humor is because it's so connected to resilience, right? And it's connected to talking about big, difficult topics, but in a digestible way, in a way that people can think about it, but not have to head on crash into it,
I have very strong opinions about this, especially how it differs between America and Japan, because I do think there is this reputation that comedy has for speaking truth to power. As you said earlier, that idea that you have these jokes that they could be dark, they could be tragic, but there's this grain of truth in things that's what makes them connect, that's what makes them funny, and it allows people to kind of process and deal with these larger ideas about social issues or justice issues or anything really. My personal opinion is that Japan doesn't have enough of that, and that America has too much of it. Because I've spent the last 4 years, even 6-7 years, watching all the comedy in America, and it doesn't apply to all of it. But again, like the mainstream late night talk shows, to me, it has been like watching the band on the Titanic. I feel like we're being entertained, but we're still going down, if that makes sense. I feel like there's so much of that content out there. All of the comedians who do anti-Trump monologues or, monologues about, climate change. And I feel that they are talking about these very big issues, but there's a sense that people watch that and then feel like watching it means that they've dealt with it, and they haven't. They watch it and they go, okay, I've laughed at this. I've thought about it. I've done something, and they haven't. It hasn't fixed the problem. And Japan doesn't have much political comedy at all. Japanese people will always say, like, it's amazing to us that we can turn on Western TV and see someone making fun of the president. That would never happen here. And so I think there's got to be kind of like a healthy medium. America, there's so much freedom to make fun of whoever you want that you make fun of them and you feel like you fixed the problem and you didn't do anything. In Japan, I think
really good point. Mary just makes a comment from Periscope. Thanks for joining, Mary. I had to laugh at that truth. That's true.
In Japan, so, I think you could use humor to kind of delve into some of these issues.
Are there any examples in Japan that kind of deal with political humor? Sometimes you'll see like cartoonists in newspapers who do a kind of satire on politics, but you don't really see stand-up comedians taking on big issues in Japan. Not so much, right?
They don't make the mainstream because they appeal to a much smaller audience. There was 3 or 4 years ago, one that Ollie showed me. There was a comedy duo called Woman Rush Hour, and their material was very political. I think they made fun of the government a lot, and also they kind of blamed, kind of in a Bill Hicks kind of way, blaming the audience for their complacency, and was very, very popular, but I haven't seen them on TV in a long time. And Japanese entertainment industry in general, because it's set up a little bit different than all of the cable TV options in the West and the wide variety of choices that you have. Cable TV in the West allows you to be very niche and still find a target audience. And Japan doesn't have that as much. So anything that's on mainstream TV has to try to appeal to everyone. And anything that's potentially offensive, anything that is going to hurt someone's feelings, Anything that someone's going to go, I disagree with this strongly enough to write a letter about it, doesn't make the broadcast.
Yeah. I was teaching at university for a long time, and I was often told by staff, don't ever say anything political, in the class. Well, by not saying anything, aren't you being political? Like it's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
difficult. It's like a double-edged sword, right?
And it's not
Has
just political.
Yeah.
It's anything that could offend businesses as well. When I was on the radio, they would say, just talk about when you have your free talk, just talk about whatever you thought about during the day or whatever you did during the day. And I remember once wanting to talk about how I'd gotten like the latest seasonal Frappuccino at Starbucks. And it would like Starbucks was just going through this phase where they were taking a different dessert and crushing it up and putting it in their coffee. It was like this month it's coffee jelly, this month it's pudding, this month it's strawberry cheesecake. It's like you've seen the pattern. They're just crushing up a dessert and putting it in their coffee. And after the show, they came on and they were like, you can't say that. And I was like, why not? And they were like, well, what if Starbucks wanted to sponsor the show? I was like, well, they don't. But they're so concerned about not alienating a potential revenue source or not alienating a potential customer. There was one time where we played a song that was the theme song for a Japanese drama about kind of the Warring States period in China. And it was a Japanese band performing in English about a Chinese event. And I kind of just made a joke that this was like very international or like it was a little bit hard to process or something simple like that. And I got a letter to the station being like, how can you say something critical about this show and this song? It's not your job to have opinions on the stuff you play. You just play it. And so it's a very different mindset in approaching how entertainment is produced and consumed.
Wow. Mary again has a comment. She says, what is Japan afraid of in terms of talking about issues? There's a lot of different things.
Mainly, I would say alienating viewers. Right. One of the most popular Japanese TV segments is they look through what was on TV last night and what had the highest ratings. And they'll say this variety bangumi, this comedy show had this moment where one of the performers was getting spanked by the host of the show for saying something wrong or something like that. You know, these very typical slapstick Japanese comedy. And this moment had a 45%. That's a crazy viewership rating, but it had a 23% or a 13% viewership, and it was the highest of the night. And it's a show dedicated to look how many people were watching this show. And so, as I said earlier, you have to appeal to as many people as possible and try to bring in the highest numbers possible. And you do that by having broadly appealing, very bland, very safe content.
Right. You were talking in Japan Station also about being hired for certain jobs for your gaijin-ness or
Yes.
your foreignness. And you're on some pretty major broadcasters. Like I want to introduce your upcoming cycle episode in NHK, which is really fun. But you've been on TV and radio for a long time in Japan. Do you still find that is happening even now on TV shows or radio?
I'm in southwestern Japan, and I would say 80% of my work is in two prefectures, Fukuoka and Saga. And Fukuoka is a huge city. Saga is not, but they're both considered local areas compared to Tokyo. They're like local affiliates of the major networks. And because I started in kind of like the boondocks, there was not this pressure to conform to a stereotype. You didn't have to you were unique enough just by being there. You didn't have to be the over-the-top foreigner that you see on Japanese entertainment going, oh my God, I can't believe this, and like reacting to everything like that. And when I started, I think that was what they expected, and they didn't get it, and they were like, oh, but, I mean, he still stands out. It's still enough. So I've been on TV so long in the local area that now actually I don't get offered the foreigner jobs anymore because I'm too much of a familiar face. Actually, when Ollie was here, I used to give Ollie those jobs. I think somebody would call me and they would go, we need a foreign reporter. And I would go, I'd be glad to do it. And they'd be like, no, you don't count as a foreign reporter anymore. You're Bobby. Do you know anybody else? And I go, yeah, there's this guy. He's not as good. But when I started trying to break into Tokyo 4 or 5 years back, I hit this wall. And this is the same wall that, Japanese comedians say that they face. They start locally, and first you have to break out locally and get famous locally. And then when you go national, you're starting all over again. And going from like being able to go on TV as myself and have people expect certain things from me, know my character, know my sense of humor, know who I was, to Tokyo audition where they would go, okay, can you be like Atsukiri Jason, who is this foreign comedian who his shtick was going, why Japanese people, about kanji. Or they would want, you to be like their image of an American radio DJ and kind of wild and very over the top gestures and over the top voice and, do the gaijin accent and all this stuff that I kind of went like, if this is what I have to do to make it in Tokyo, then I'm happy just earning my bread locally where I can be myself and not feel conflicted or, like I was perpetuating a stereotype or selling out.
Yeah. But your language ability really comes from being in Saga and Kyushu. Have you had any issues with like speaking Saga Ben or Fukuoka Ben and then being in a Tokyo situation and they're like, can you tone it down with the Ben or the dialect?
Opposite.
No?
The
Oh,
opposite,
wow.
the opposite. They want you to play it up. Anytime you've got a foreign face and a local dialect is what's coming out, they love it. To the point where when I get nervous or when I get very focused on what I'm talking about, I tend to speak formal Japanese. And they're like, you need to relax and let that local character come out. They love that. The only issue I've ever had with it is for one of the shows I did a show called Sekai Fushigi Hakken, which is a long-running show, primetime on a national network. And they were like, we want you to speak as much Saga Ben as possible. And then when I watched it back, it was clear that like they didn't understand enough of the Saga Ben to know what I was saying. There were a handful of times where I was using a word that they didn't register it as a word, they registered it as sounds. Like they couldn't tell if it was English or just me going and making noises. But so I think they want you to play it up as much as you can because it provides flavor.
Wow. Well, let's talk about Saga a little bit because you started as a jet in Saga. And
Mm-hmm.
Ollie told me that you went back during the disaster and you helped with volunteering as well. So you still, and you're on a TV show or radio show, you said. So you still have ties back to Saga. Is that right?
Yeah. My wife is technically from Saga Prefecture. She's from one of those places that has like an inner city rivalry, so they don't say they're from Saga, like they're from Karatsu. But she's technically from Saga Prefecture. And the first real TV job I had, the regular TV job, like a weekly one, was with Saga TV, and they gave me my own cooking segment, and I've been doing that for 10 years now. So I still do that once a week. Yeah, Saga is ranked 45 out of 47 in terms of most attractive prefectures in Japan. But I think that's a lot of lack of public relations and communications. It's a beautiful place, and they've got a lot of great stuff to do and see. It's really nice.
Yeah, we were jets in Oita, and we had some of our jet friends were in Saga, so we've been there a few times. It's beautiful country,
Yeah,
countryside, inaka, true inaka.
yeah. Well, I mean, Saga City's got 2 movie theaters. How inaka can it be?
Well, that you can't use now during coronavirus, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about your NHK cycle show that's coming up. That's
Okay.
exciting.
Yeah. So this Saturday, I guess, the 12th,
Yep.
we'll start broadcasting. It's a NHK show called Cycle Around Japan, and I've been working with them for 3 or 4 years now. It's a show where they have, a visitor to Japan, a non-Japanese person traveling the country, traveling a certain region of the country on a bicycle. And you go around and you meet local people, you have different experiences, you eat the local food, you check out the local onsen. Very standard kind of travel show, but it's done by bicycle. And it's a lot of fun. They had to kind of revamp it and figure out a different way to do it because of coronavirus, because you can't be leaving Tokyo and taking your potential pandemic to the local areas which are not affected by them. So they had a special episode where usually they have one cyclist traveling. This time they had 2 of us play a bingo game where we cycled through Tokyo for day and tried to find as many kind of items on a bingo card as possible. And it was things like, find a sumo wrestler, find a famous hill, or find a famous tree, or find a dagashi-yasan, traditional Japanese candy store. And it was really different. We're riding through Tokyo, and there's things like find a chicken farm or find like a fruit orchard, and to spend a day biking through Tokyo and to see so many different kinds of scenery that you wouldn't expect in a major metropolitan area was really, really cool.
Yeah, and it looks like you're introducing, like I've got the bingo card from the NHK page up right now. You're introducing like a slit drum or dagashia, local sweet shop, or monjayaki, local
Yeah.
delicacy. So you're also introducing a lot of small shops, which I assume are really struggling now during coronavirus.
Yeah, that was one of the things that monjayaki is a traditional Japanese kind of snack food. It's like a wetter okonomiyaki. It's okonomiyaki without as much vegetables inside to hold it together. Um, but it's very cheap, and it was like something that kids could buy on their way home from school at the local convenience store or the local sweet shop with just a handful of yen in their pocket. Um, but there's this famous street, the Monjayaki Street, where there's all of these shops that tourists come from all over to kind of fill up all the shops that line this street and try the local Monjayaki. And it's a ghost town now. It's deserted. And I think I think TV is really making an effort to do everything that they can to introduce some of these places, and TV always focuses on restaurants and travel things and recommendations and things like that. But there's a new focus on kind of like how hard these people are working and how difficult their struggle is at the moment, and how even takeout, even buying something from them online, even buying gift certificates for when things quiet down. All these ways to support the businesses get incorporated into the shows now, and I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, definitely. But don't you feel that they need more support than just what being on TV might help? Like
Yes.
they
Yeah, yeah.
need more financial subsidies to get through this time while they can't, do
Absolutely.
normal business, don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think GoToTravel has been a disaster. GoToTravel, GoToEat has been a disaster, not only for, the health concerns, not only for, this was something that the country was not ready for, infection wise. I think it's been a disaster in terms of how it was implemented, because the whole idea is, just as you're saying, Joy, to support local businesses that are struggling. And in doing these jobs, you go do a 2 or 3 day shoot or a week-long shoot in Tokyo or a local area, and they book you into a hotel, and you get your travel tickets. You get your GoToEat tickets or your GoToTravel Shohinken, the little gift certificates that let you ostensibly support local businesses. And in my experience, the number of actual businesses that are registered with these programs and can use the tickets are so few and far between. And the ones that are registered tend to be major corporations and chains, to the point where one time I stayed at a hotel in Tokyo and was like, I got in late at night and was like, I'm looking for something to eat. Is there anywhere in walking distance of the hotel in a big city? Is there anywhere in walking distance of the hotel where I can use these tickets? And there are tons of restaurants in walking distance of the hotel that were open at the time. And guess where I could use them? Guess the only place that I could use them?
McDonald's?
Lawson's, the
Lawson.
convenience store Lawson's.
Convenience
And
store,
so
yeah.
you're using your GoToTravel money to support a giant convenience store conglomeration chain. And staying in other areas, you walk into a local mom and pop restaurant and they go, no, we can't use those, we can't use those. And then you walk into the Watami Group's izakaya, or Haibal Sakaba, which is run by these major corporations, and they're taking the money.
And
So
it,
I
it
think the
comes from
implementation,
it comes from tax money. So it
yeah,
really should be finding a way back to the small businesses which are really struggling right now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, and speaking of Saga is too local to have their own Uber Eats, and so they made local Uber Eats, which is like they made their own, this exact same business model, but it's all local people doing it and local people driving and going to local restaurants and kind of copying that successful large business model in a way that benefits the local community much, much more.
That's awesome idea. I hope
Yeah.
they replicate that in other small areas. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
When I was in Oita, I remember seeing all the, you don't see them now. You see a lot of Uber or Wolt or the other delivery companies, but you used to see loads of mopeds with the hydraulic ramen
Yeah.
on the back so it doesn't
Yeah.
spill, delivering to people's houses in reusable bowls and then
Yeah.
picking up the bowls and stuff later. So, in terms of using that old style that they used to do for delivery, it's actually so much more sustainable in
Yeah.
terms of reusing the bowls and plates, but also supporting the mom and pop places
Yeah.
run by local people. It's awesome. I hope we can
Mm.
get back to that now that they see how successful Uber Eats is. Hopefully, the local version like Saga will pick
Yeah.
up. That's great. Yeah, I love that. Let's talk a little bit about how you got started, how you got your claim to fame. Was it YouTube, you think, where you really got well known?
Yeah. So I started YouTubing half as a hobby, half as Japanese practice. And even though that now makes two halves, I'm going to throw in another half. Not the best at math. Another reason for starting YouTube was because I knew I wanted to work in the entertainment industry or the television industry, and I wanted a portfolio. I wanted to have something to say. This is my level of Japanese ability. This is my cooking. This is what I could provide for your show. And so I started YouTube, kind of thinking that's where it would take me. And before that happened, YouTube itself got a lot of attention, and I think I got one of kind of like the medium sized. I never got to the point where I could have made a living doing YouTube like some of the major YouTubers, but in terms of channel size, it got big enough that people were noticing, and I would get contacted and asked us to do a sponsored video or get contacted by a local TV station to ask if I could come on a show. And that's what got me on Saga TV. That's what got me my cooking segment there. And from there, it kind of expanded into the neighboring prefecture, Fukuoka. And I think the more things you do, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but they hire you for your foreignness, and the bar is so low that if you outperform their expectations, they're kind of blown away. And one of the things that I've always struggled with is that Japan expects so little from you. They want a foreign face who's going to provide some international flavor and maybe go, oh my God, every once in a while. And if you can string sentences together and say something insightful and be funny in the language, then they're blown away. And so one of my big struggles is that I have very strict expectations of myself. And if I'm not firing on all cylinders, if I'm not giving 100%, if I give like 60% or 70%, I walk away feeling like I failed. But they expected 10%. So they're always very pleased. And I think after a handful of years, I got to the point where they weren't hiring me for foreignness. They were hiring me because they knew I could provide value to the broadcast in a different way.
Yeah, nice. And you learned Japanese in high school in
No,
classes in
in
Florida,
university.
is that right? Oh, university.
Yeah, I
And
took a year at college in Florida, but it was beginner's Japanese, and I got to the point where I could ask, what time it was and if the vegetable store had onions and things like that. But then move into Saga, which has a very strong dialect. Oita, I'm sure, has a strong dialect as well. But the Japanese sounds sa, shi, su, se, so in Saga becomes shashi, shu, she, sho. And so you would say, like, if you wanted to ask the teacher what the teacher is doing, you would say, Sensei, nani shitemasu ka? And in Saga, they'd say, Shenshei namba shoto. And yeah, and it was the first year that I'd studied, did very, very little to help me in Saga. But once my ears got used to how the sounds had been adjusted, I had my grammar base, and then I spent 6 years living in Saga, where you either learn the language or you don't have a successful shopping trip at the grocery store. You can't get a bank account or your cell phone plan, things like that.
Yeah, you talk about being motivated by the desire to communicate. And I
Yeah.
think that that has been my success and downfall for me as well, is that I really want to communicate with people. So I've never you've done so well with perfecting your polite Japanese.
Mhm.
But that having that desire to communicate definitely makes you work harder at being able to communicate in Japanese when you're living here, right?
Yeah. I think a lot of that is ego driven for me. I think my modes of communication in general, I want somebody to think that I'm well spoken. I want somebody to think that I'm correct in my position. And, when you don't have all the language skills at your disposal, whatever you have in your head that you want to say, you have to say the simplest version of it or the wrong version of it. And I remember moments where I'd walk away from conversations going, I did not represent myself well. I sounded dumb. I sounded like I didn't know what I was talking about. Um, I was angry and I wanted to communicate my anger, and I didn't have the tools to do that, um, either cultural or linguistic. And in Japan, I think if you're operating in a foreign language, this is funny because it ties into comedy as well, but anything that you want to communicate, especially in Japan, is so hampered by any little missteps. If you pronounce a word wrong, I've talked about this in other places, but in my mind, when I was first learning, I would get so frustrated at people not understanding me and going, I only made a small mistake. Why didn't they understand me? They should have gotten that. But you don't realize that in Japanese, you make one pronunciation error and you haven't, it's not like you wanted to say Florida and you said Frolida. It's like you wanted to say hamburger and you said shoe. You said a totally different word. And so that throws the Japanese person off so much that a lot of times the conversation doesn't recover. So any desire to communicate, you realize any mistakes you make takes so much time to recover. It makes the person that you're talking to take such a large step back that I really started to feel like, it's on me to be as clear as I can, to have a really wide range of vocabulary and phrases at my disposal. And especially once you start working in TV or in radio, where there's so much depends on how you phrase something. And if you say something wrong, you might have, said something rude. You might have said something incomprehensible. I remember there was one time, you know the phrase in Japanese, tondemonai?
Mm-hmm.
Tondemonai means like, it doesn't matter, like whatever. It can mean anything from, get out of here, to like,
Or
it's
no
not a big
problem,
deal.
or yeah,
Yeah.
don't worry about it.
But you could say tondemonai. But there was something that somebody apologized to me for something, and I wanted to say, it's not a big deal. And I said, I wanted to say tondemonai. And instead I said, tondemonai koto. Which a tondemonai koto, if you add that one word koto, it means that's an insane thing. And so where I wanted to say no problem, it was like it had turned it around on them to where it was like, I can't believe that you do something like that. And they were like, oh, Bobby was really mad about that. I was like, no. So part of it is kind of my wanting to be a perfectionist in communication, and part of it is ego, is wanting to go, I acquitted myself well and they thought well of me and I was able to convince them that what I thought was right. So
Yeah. I mean, I've made so many mistakes over the years being in Japan, of course. My favorite mistake, which I sometimes say now on purpose, is people would always compliment me. I was in my early 20s when I first came to Japan. People would say, "Oh, you're so beautiful. You're so smart." And I was taught to say, gomasuri, right?
gomasuri.
But I would often say, gomisuru, you're making garbage by mistake, which I just said.
Yeah.
And, then my sister tells stories in Tokyo how, people would always stare, oh, you can use chopsticks. And she would pretend to eat the plastic in the bento, and they're like, no. And she's like, yeah. So it's like getting over yourself, right? Like just making fun of yourself is a great way to bridge the gap in terms of culture and language, right?
That's a really good point, because I talked about, wanting to be seen as well spoken, or wanting people to know, you know that my opinion was correct, or this and that. But also, I think a tool that you end up using, especially in comedy and especially in entertainment, is being able to laugh at yourself. And it's kind of paradoxical, but like using those language tools to be wrong on purpose, or to make yourself the butt of the joke, is another way of demonstrating how skilled you are at the language. Um, and so I think in my comedy and in my Japanese, I tend to be extremely self-deprecating, which somehow also comes from a place of ego.
Wow. Yeah, that's
Right.
wild. I talking of Japanese comedy, quite often, like if I watch Japanese TV, we don't
Mm,
often have Japanese TV on because I
mm,
find it really annoying and really cruel
mm,
and too brash in
mm.
the style of shows and comedy, especially. But my kids love it. My kids grew born and raised here in
Yeah,
Japan, and they really get it. But not growing up here, there's so much I can't forgive in terms of cruelty and making other people the butt of the joke, or
mm. Can
um,
you think of
like
any specifics?
sexism.
Yeah.
Just there's this comedy show that's really popular at the moment, which my son, who's 18, really loves. And it's just torturing people. It's like putting them on camera, watching their reactions when they're actually hurting them, or
Uh,
and that kind of, and then the other person's in the other room just laughing about it, how funny it is. And then
yeah,
if I find myself laugh a bit, it makes me horrified that I could
yeah.
laugh at somebody else's pain. Like I don't want to give in to that. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I think that goes back to what we talked about, lowest common denominator, that stuff that appeals on this gut level, where you see somebody fall down and you don't want to laugh, but you do, because it was a surprising thing, or they fell down in a funny way. And you feel bad, you want to check on them and see if they're okay, but your gut instinct is to go aha for a second. And I think it's good that we're able to police those instincts, but I don't think there's a sense in Japan that they need to be policed, especially in terms of the sexism and the attacking somebody's appearance as a joke, or making fun of the fat person, or all this stuff that's very common on Japanese TV. And there are people who build their entire careers out of having other Japanese celebrities call them ugly, especially women in the comedy industry. And again, that's one thing that I try my hardest not to do in my comedy. One of the huge things that is a trope on Japanese TV is making fun of people for poor English, to the point where there are entire shows that revolve around people trying to speak English when they can't do it well. And I've always felt that one of the major problems with English language education in Japan is that there is this cultural mindset, and a lot of it is subconscious, but there's this cultural mindset that languages are not something that it's okay to fail at. Languages are not something that, it's okay to speak if you're not perfect. You notice on TV, whenever they have a foreigner who can speak Japanese or a Japanese person who can speak English, they're treated as though it's amazing, as though it's this special ability, as though they're a genius. And what that tells people watching subconsciously is that if you're not a genius, you can't do this. If you don't have a special ability, you can't do this. And the other way they portray English on TV is to make it the butt of a joke. Somebody tries it and they can't do it, and then they get laughed at. And it's funny to watch somebody, saying the wrong thing, or to talk about, miscommunication or language errors. We enjoy talking about it as well, but I think we enjoy talking about it in oh, I made this mistake and I was embarrassed and I learned. And on Japanese TV, it doesn't connect to the learning part. It's just like they're wrong. And so you end up with these two messages: one, that only special people can do this, and two, if you try and you fail, you're going to be laughed at. It's something embarrassing. And I do an English segment. It's on hiatus because of the pandemic, but I do an on the street English segment where you interview people and ask them questions in English and try to teach a certain phrase, or or identify a certain communication point in the segment. And the Japanese directors want the segment to be funny when people make mistakes. And I've always kind of like, as the foreigner on the show, whenever they want an easy laugh, they'll go, okay, someone's going to try to say something in English, and then you jump in and you go, no, 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 that's not how it's pronounced. And I'll always refuse to do that. And when we started this segment, I was like, I just want to make it really clear that whenever we talk to people, I want to make sure we're creating this environment where making mistakes is okay, where, you know, they say their grammar isn't right, or they get a slightly incorrect word. And I want to go, okay, if you were to say that in a real conversation, if I had really asked you this question about, you know, where the convenience store is or where the drugstore is, and you said exactly what you just said, grammar mistakes and all, I would get the information that I needed and I would make it to the convenience store and I would be grateful. That said, this is the grammatically correct phrasing. You know, this is something that you could use to make it a little bit more clear, or, you know, an extra phrase. And I think it's productive, but it's also not necessarily funny to watch. And so when selecting the people that we interview, we've gotten really good at figuring out which people are okay with laughing at themselves and which people are scared. And you start to talk to somebody and they go, well, I don't really know. I'm not sure. I'm not good at English. And you go, okay, well, thank you for your time. And then you talk to somebody else who goes, yeah, what do you want to know? I'll try my best. And as soon as you get one of those people, you go, okay, we can do this in a productive and a fun way where you're not making anyone feel bad about it.
Absolutely. Well, after many years of English teaching, I agree 100%. And communication, especially in English, is fluid. And it's case by case. And we have to negotiate meaning all the time, even amongst native speakers, right? Because that's the way English works. And there is no perfect phrase that's going to work every time, every situation. So
Right.
yeah, definitely. It's great that you're being the rational person in the room. And being a parent of bilingual kids now, you're going to
Yeah.
run into this all the time. My kids in public school in Japan failing their English test, even though they're native speakers, because they're not writing with the certain phrase that was taught in the class.
Right.
They're doing something totally acceptable, but wasn't on the book, right?
I remember seeing this a while back. Somebody on Twitter posted something where, you know, their son had a written exam and the question was, what color is the backpack? And they had written blue. And they failed because they wanted it is blue. And it's a totally natural, totally normal thing to answer the question. And if you look at it in terms of communication, it's a complete success. It's native, it's normal, it's a success. But you didn't hit the grammar point that they wanted you to hit. So
yeah, and the teachers are caught in a really difficult position. I think this is one way the JET program can actually help if they're allowed to be the voice of reason and the real native speaker, and this is the way English is actually working in reality. But the key is travel, getting teachers, getting more people to go abroad and just try using English, right? That's the key.
yeah, and also reevaluating the importance placed on these tests.
Yes.
Although I will say I did just speak to the Ishikawa guys, and Casey was saying he heard how these standardized tests or the Japanese education system around English can sometimes be a really positive supplement for bilingual kids who grow up mostly speaking it and not having the same writing. So you don't have that drilled writing practice of, you know, making sure your sentences are all put together right and your grammar is right and your syntax is right. You're just used to speaking it. And he'd heard people talk about how, you know, having those kind of drills, the Japanese style English language drilled repetitive grammar could be seen as a good supplement to just a largely audio, a largely spoken, oral is the word that I wanted, a largely oral education.
Well, that wasn't the case for our kids. English class was always torture for them, and me especially, and trying really hard not to say too much because you know the teachers can only change or do so much. It's not really the teachers; it's the system, right?
My girls are 5 and they're their second year of preschool, but they've already kind of had this a little bit because they have English teachers that come to the school twice a month or something like that. And once a month they get a native English teacher, and then the other time they get 2 Japanese women who come. And so the first time they ever had an English lesson, I was really excited to hear how it went. And I said, "Oh, you had an English teacher. What were their names?" And they said, "Mika sensei and Haruka sensei." And I said, "Oh, and how was it?" And they kind of looked at me and they were like, "I think our English is better than theirs." But they're learning. They're
Yeah.
trying their best.
Yeah. And I think what your daughters will learn, and it sounds like they're already doing it, is to be gracious and
Yeah.
not to be too harsh on people trying to use English in Japan, right?
Yeah. Well, we get that at home because my wife's English isn't perfect, and my girls' English. I mean, they're 5. Their English isn't perfect. Their Japanese isn't perfect. So we do a lot of very gentle, empathetic mirroring, where you don't correct somebody or make them repeat themselves. You just kind of give them the right example back as they're speaking. Um, and so we never say someone is bad at a language. We say they're learning.
Yeah. We've got some comments here. Joe Fowler, thanks for joining from Periscope, says the aim of learning a language is communication, not perfection. We all need to learn that. Thanks, Joe. Wendy says very insightful in many ways. Comedy, culture, language. Thank you. Molly says my summer job in college was to acclimate Japanese students to American English, also
Ooh,
to Pittsburgh culture. How interesting.
to
Wow.
Pittsburgh culture.
Every state is different. You're from Florida, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I love your
Very
story of
unique.
taking your wife to the Japanese garden in Florida and having it full of iguanas.
Yeah, yeah. The very typical Japanese style curated garden that year just happened to be overgrown with iguanas.
Oh my gosh. Well, we have a few more minutes. I haven't mentioned that you did a book, which I found on Fukuoka
Oh,
Now,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
on things that people around the world find interesting about Japan. Is that right?
This is one of those moments where I was trying to break into a national audience or a larger Tokyo um, arena, and the agency that I was with at the time, I had written a book. I'd done my best and written a book in Japanese called The Angry Foreigner. And it was a lot of kind of what I had been trying to explain on YouTube about why certain times foreigners take offense at certain treatment. The Japanese person thinks they're being complimentary, they think they're being nice or hospitable, and that can rub foreigners the wrong way. And a lot of what I did on YouTube was my best to do a polite explanation of why you shouldn't assume someone doesn't speak Japanese, why you shouldn't assume someone speaks English, why you shouldn't take the Japanese menu away from somebody in a restaurant without asking, um, stuff like that. And so I had written this whole book about how relationships between Japanese people and foreigners in the country could be improved, and explaining kind of like when you have a moment where you meant well, but a foreigner walks away offended, or you go, did something go wrong? Maybe why that happened. And so we started trying to sell this book, and we took it to a publishing company, and they said, we really like it, we really like you, but this is a second book. In Japan, if you don't start by getting everybody on your side, if you were to just publish this, they'd go, this guy is telling us what to do. He's critical, he's this and that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by publishing a book where you talk about all the things that you like about Japan. And then this will be the second book. And I said, well, there's already all this content of foreigners doing that. There's so much. This was after the Olympics had just been announced, and so it was like there was this huge boom in content of Japan going, look, the world loves us. Look how much the world loves us. And they said, if you put out a book like that, that could help launch your career. And it turns out that the book came out exactly at the same time as like 7 or 8 other books like that, where other foreigners were doing the same thing. But it wasn't the book that I had originally wanted to write, but it also was true to what I thought. Like I was very specific about staying true to my YouTube style content, where I presented things as not cut and dried. And it's hard to explain, but when we were doing the book writing process, anything I would say about cultural differences between America, one of the things that was a big point of interest for Japanese people was different attitudes towards sexuality. And in my experience, I've always found that Japan is much more open about sexuality than we are in the West, because there are no cultural taboos or religious taboos about, sex being dirty or sex being, for procreation only or this or that. And one of the things that was most surprising to me coming from kind of a not a strict conservative, but my parents are, baby boomers, and they grew up in a little bit of a different era. But when you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or even like a long-term serious boyfriend, live-in girlfriend, when you went home to stay at your parents' house, you slept in separate bedrooms. And when I went to meet my wife's family for the first time, we had this big drinking party at my wife's house, and we'd been dating for about a year. But it's the first time I've ever met her family, and we'd planned to stay over. And I mentioned something about like sleeping on the couch, and the dad was like, "Why would you sleep on the couch? Sleep in the same room." And then also, like, you know how Japanese have communal, the family all uses the same bathwater. If you're not familiar with this concept, you might go, what? But they do it like a hot spring, where like everybody kind of washes their body and then soaks in the bath. And a family will use the same bathwater, and guests get to use the bathwater first. And they were like, "All right, you guys go jump in the bath before bed." And it was like, this is the first time I've ever met my wife's family. But they're like, "Yeah, go take a bath together." Which is a little bit rare for even in Japanese families, that's a little bit rare. But that idea of not having sexuality be this taboo thing or this dirty thing that you have to hide, or act like you're not doing it. And I wanted to talk about that. And so in my book, I'd mentioned kind of the religious influence and how a lot of people in America have either these hang-ups about sex being taboo or sinful or dirty. And the writer who was helping me write it was like, "Okay, so we'll just say in America, sex is seen as dirty." I was like, "No, it's seen as dirty by some people." And she was like, "Yeah, but to make this kind of like more easy for Japanese people to understand, it's just better to say everyone." And I was like, "But then it's a lie. Then it's not true." So I was very careful about making sure I only said things that I actually thought, and I only said things that I actually meant. But it turned into kind of like this praise fest of Japan, or this very, very standard, these are the things that foreigners like about Japan or find interesting about Japan. And I'm proud to have done it. I mean, it turned out to be a
Yeah.
good book, I think. But
No, it's great that
but it
you've
was,
you've done
yeah.
it. I'd love to see an English version where you talk to international audience about all your things
Yeah.
that you've learned over the years in Japan, a tell-all, but then that might hurt your
Yeah.
career in Japan.
I actually am working on, I've got about 100 pages cranked out. I'm working on a book about my 10 years on TV in Japan, and kind of like the things that I've learned culturally, the things that I've learned about myself. And hopefully I get it finished, and maybe I can come back on and announce it.
I'd love that. I'd love to have you back on. That is our hour. Thanks so much, Bobby. That was
Yeah, it
great.
was a lot of fun.
Thanks, everybody, for joining. We had a lot of great comments and questions today. You can find Bobby on Japan by River Cruise podcast, Bobby
Oh,
Judo,
it's
YouTube.
Japan
No,
by River Cruise.
what did I
You got to say it like
say?
that. Japan
Okay.
by River Cruise.
Japan by River Cruise. Is that right?
Yeah, very good.
Okay. And that's it for this week. We have talks all week next week from the 14th, starting with Hiko Simon. So please
Oh,
join
tell him I
us
said hi.
again. Yeah, I will. Has he
I
been
haven't
on
talked
your
to him in a
show?
while. He
No?
hasn't been on ours, but when we were YouTubers coming up together.
Nice. YouTube Club back in the day.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. Have a great day. Bye.